Hey, you've heard a lot about CVE and CVSS the last week or so. Well, let's take a dive into it to give you a better understanding for you as a CISO. So, even though you may be familiar with some of this, you should be familiar with all of it. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is G. Mark Hardy. I'm your host for today, and we're going to dive into an issue that's been shaking our cybersecurity community recently, the recent funding crisis surrounding the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, or CVE database. Now, for those of you who are familiar with it, of course, we know that this is a cornerstone of global cybersecurity. And for a while this past week, its future was, well, uncertain. And we're going to explore the history of vulnerability tracking, how the CVE system works, its scoring mechanisms, and why this matters to you as a security leader. And then we're going to unpack this recent funding challenges and what they could mean moving forward. So let's get started. Now, to understand the significance of the CVE database, we need to step back a little bit and look at the history of computer vulnerability tracking. Now, in the early days of computing, vulnerabilities were often documented informally. Think security mailing list, vendor advisory, or even word of mouth among researchers. There were really no standardized ways to catalog or communicate flaws. And so by the late 1980s, early 1990s, as networks grew, the internet took shape, the need for some sort of structure around vulnerability tracking really became clear. Now, early efforts included databases like the Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT, advisories that were launched back, I think, around 1988 by Carnegie Mellon University, then vendor-specific bug reports. And these are the precursors to modern systems, but they really lacked global coordination and consistency. I remember the early versions of the antivirus tools that came out in the late 1980s, and they would be able to have a count at the end. Norton blocks 20,000, 22,000, 23,000 viruses and things such as that. Then McAfee would block their certain number of viruses, but you didn't know whether they're the same or if they were double counting, etc. So there was a lot that was out there, but really no standardization. And so now by the mid 1990s, you've got this chaos in the community of multiple names for essentially the same vulnerability. For example, a flaw in one software might be called buffer overflow X by one vendor and then exploit Y by another, which could lead to a lot of confusion. Then you look at things, people might be naming them after whatever favorite drink you might be having at the time. Let's call this Code Red. It didn't advertise as Code Red, but it happened to be what we were drinking that night when we were solving it. So yeah, we'll just call it Code Red. As you can imagine, this got very confusing. It was very difficult to know that we were talking about the same thing when you're dealing with the same issue. Now, by 1999, the CVE program was envisioned and started out. It was spearheaded by MITRE. And MITRE is a federally funded research and development center, FFRDC. Think of them as a not-for-profit organization. They're not a nonprofit organization. They're a not-for-profit. It's very different. And if you really want to look it up, I suppose you could go digging in Google or something like that. But fundamentally, they get their funding from the U.S. government, but their goal isn't to make a maximum profit. They're not going to go ahead and try to say, hey, can we cut corners on this thing so we could throw more money in our partners' pockets? It's not how it works. But rather what it's designed to do is to say, hey, we're going to act sort of as an extension of the government, but be able to attract and retain smart, intelligent people who don't want to be government employees, but they're very happy working for a not-for-profit. I had interviewed with MITRE back when I was leaving active duty. This is a long time ago. And I had looked at it. I didn't quite understand at the time what not-for-profit meant. All I knew is that here I was, a 20-something-year-old young buck wanting to get out there and make a name for himself in the world. And I didn't think I wanted to be sitting there and not making money. Well, that's not at all what it means. So if you're not familiar with it, or if you've ever been approached or thought about going to MITRE, and you seem to be turned off by what you thought was a mission of not-for-profit, do your homework. And you'll find out that it's not a terrible thing at all. It actually is an opportunity for some really wonderful careers. Now, in this particular case, back to the show that we're talking about, CVE wasn't the first attempt at standardization, but it became, well, the most successful. It replaced all these disjointed systems like CERT, which had vulnerability nodes, some early commercial databases, but the goal was what? To provide a single authoritative catalog for publicly disclosed vulnerabilities, ensuring everyone, vendors, researchers, defenders, spoke the same language. Now, how does this CVE system work? At the core, it's really just a database, and it's a database that's going to assign unique identifiers called CVE IDs, wow, to vulnerabilities in software, hardware, and firmware. And these IDs are going to be given a format like CVE hyphen year hyphen number, like CVE 2025 12345, where the year indicates when the vulnerability was cataloged, not necessarily discovered or posted. And the number is a unique identifier so that there's no duplication. Now, MITRE is a primary CVE editor, oversees the programs, but it also relies on a network of CVE numbering authorities, or CNAs, worldwide. So these CNAs, which include vendors and researchers and organizations like Microsoft, Red Hat, even some cybersecurity firms, will submit their vulnerabilities that they discover to MITRE, which will verify them and then assign a CVE ID. The CVE database, which is accessible at cve.org, provides standardization descriptions, including the affected products, severity, and remediation steps. Now, the CVE program isn't just a list. It's really a coordination hub. And when a vulnerability is discovered, the CNAs ensure that it's cataloged consistently, avoiding duplications. And then the standardization is critical for vulnerability scanners, patch management tools, threat intel platforms, all of which are going to rely upon a CVE ID to track and prioritize flaws. Now, as of April 2025, the CVE database contains over 275,000 records, which is a real testament to its role as a backbone of global vulnerability management. Now, let's talk about scoring these vulnerabilities because, well, let's face it, not all flaws are created equal. The CVE program itself doesn't assign severity scores. They just are a catalog and things are posted up there. Rather, it's integrated closely with the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, which is developed by the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST, FIRST.org. CVSS provides a standardized way to assess the severity of a vulnerability, producing a score from 0 to 10. And the higher the score, the more critical the vulnerability. Now, if you think about it, that makes sense. We could say, for example, that our patch management program is going to focus on those vulnerabilities that have a CVSS above 7, above 8, above 9, whatever your threshold happens to be. The lower the number, the less important it may be. Now, let me give you a quick example. You can go ahead and if you go to first.org/CVSS and then look up at the calculator will then give you a way to figure out what the score should be based upon a number of inputs. Now, it's gone through several versions. The version 1 came out in 2005, and it was a starting point, but it really didn't have any granularity. And you can go here. I'm looking at the archives right now and things such as that. Version 2 came out in 2007, added metrics like exploitability and impact. In CVSS 3.0, and then it was updated 3.1, but 3.0 came out in 2015. It refined scoring for modern threats, accounting for factors like user interaction and network exposure. And then the latest, CVSS 4.0, which came out in 2023, adds metrics for attack complexity, safety impact, makes it a little bit more relevant for Internet of Things and critical infrastructure. Each of these CVEs record typically information that has a CVSS score. They'll be provided by the CNAs, organizations like NIST, and then this CVE record is going to help security teams prioritize their patching. So if I go, for example, to looking at the calculator, we'll find out that the base metrics are going to include things such as the attack vector. Is it from the network? Is it adjacent, local, or physical? Now think about it. Which is more dangerous? Something coming from the network, right? Because anybody in the world could go ahead and get you, as compared to physical, which means you have to have a finger on the keyboard or a screwdriver in your hand to work on the device. How about the attack complexity? Low or high, which is worse? Low, because simple things that could go bad are worse than very complicated things that can go bad because a threat actor might not know how to go ahead and pull off a complicated attack. You're starting to get to the thing. What are the attack requirements? Okay, do I have to have a specific deployment? Do they have to be present or nothing really requirement there? That's fairly new in the 4.0. Privileges required. none, low, or high. Now, if I have to be admin or root to pull it off, it's a little bit different than if I can do it as a guest user, isn't it? And then ultimately user interaction. If there's no user interaction required, but it still will work as an exploit, that's a problem as compared to it's rather passive, where the user has to go ahead and get something started, or active, where you actually have to key things in. So now beyond these base metrics, we continue on with exploitability, vulnerability system, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Now we can look at subsequent system impact, supplemental metrics, environmental, and threat metrics. And it goes a lot out there. Essentially, what you end up doing is you can calculate things out, and you can put a shorthand where, for example, at the attack vector, let's say that this thing has some low impact on confidentiality, but it is a network complex requirement for attack, requires no privileges, I'll get a higher score. If it has a high impact on confidentiality, a high impact on integrity, a high impact on availability on my system, this can be, I'm at 9.9 right now, and boom, when you go ahead and you get CI&A all maxed out across the board, I don't have to do anything, you got a 10.0. And so what we find then is that these scores are relative to each other. There's not something that's it's absolutely a 10 or a 9.8 or whatever, but the idea is what? A score with a 9.8, make a remotely exploitable flaw with no user interaction, really demands immediate action. But I have a score of 3.5, might be a lower priority, or I might not even care about it. For example, let's say I have a pair of trousers and they have a pocket and I put change in the pocket. All right, operational. Now I start to develop a hole in the bottom of the pocket. Well, how bad is it? Let's say the hole is big enough to let a penny fall out. But let's forget about the fact that dimes are smaller than pennies for now. But the idea is the worst you can do is you can drop a penny here and there. But to go ahead and that's a vulnerability, right? We're going to assign a score to it. Maybe it's a 3.0. But to fix it might cost you $20 at a tailor. Are you in the course of owning those trousers for the rest of their lifetime going to lose 2,000 pennies? Probably not. So you say, I'm just going to live with it. And so you don't want to clean all of them up. In fact, you get to a point where the cost of remediating one of these vulnerabilities probably exceeds the likely loss that you encounter from it, which is why you really need to understand what's going on here. And that's why I'm digging into this a little bit to help you see that if you didn't have a CVE and CVSS, you're sort of flying blind. You say, hey, there's a vulnerability. I'm losing money. Well, it could be a problem that somebody has stolen my private key from my Bitcoin wallet, and that requires instant, immediate attention. Or there's a small hole in my pocket, and every now and then a penny will drop out on the sidewalk. See? Same thing works for cybersecurity. We want to go ahead and have ways to prioritize so that we can make sure that we're working on the right thing. Okay, so why now and why am I decide to go ahead and do the episode this week? Because recently we've heard about the CVE program being kind of in danger. On the 15th of April this year, 2025, MITRE announced that its contract with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, specifically CISO, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, to operate the CVE and related common weakness enumeration or CVE programs was set to expire the following day. That's it. Midnight, turn into pumpkin. And this news really sent shockwaves throughout the cybersecurity community because the CVE database, it's a critical resource relied upon by governments, enterprises, researchers worldwide. Now, this funding lapse stemmed from the U.S. government's decision not to renew MITRE's contract for this, a move reported by outlets like The Register and Forbes. I'd read some of that in the press. And MITRE's vice president, Yosri Basroun, warned that a break in service could lead to the deterioration of national vulnerability databases, advisories, tool vendors, incident response operations, and critical infrastructure. The cybersecurity community reacted swiftly, and experts like former CISO Director Jen Easterly, security journalist Brian Krebs highlighted the catastrophic impact and the implications of a potential shutdown. However, on the 16th of April, just hours before the deadline, CISA extended MITRE's funding for 11 more months, ensuring no immediate lapse in the CVE services. Now, this extension was confirmed by multiple sources, including Reuters. I think I read about it on Bleeping Computer. And CISA emphasized that the CVE program is invaluable and a priority, but the last-minute nature of the decision really raised concerns about long-term stability. Casey Ellis, who's a founder of BugCrowd, had noted that the incident kind of put a dent in confidence in the CVE process, highlighting there's a lot of risk in relying on just-in-time funding. Now, in response to this uncertainty, some organizations said, hey, we got to take some action. So a coalition of CVE board members, including representatives from Microsoft, Intel, and Cisco, announced the creation of the CVE Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at securing the program's independence. Now, this foundation, which I read in Cyber News, seeks to fund the CVE database through private and industry contributions, which is going to reduce the reliance on a single government sponsor. Now, Kent Landfield, a CVE Foundation officer, called the program too important to be vulnerable itself. While the foundation plans are still forming, it aims to ensure that the CVE database remains a globally trusted, community-driven initiative. Or as somebody else I had read somewhere, I think it was on X, who said, yeah, I bet losing funding for the CVE was not in the CVE database itself. So what does the future hold for the CVE program? Let's speculate a little bit based on the facts. The 11-month funding extension buys time, but it may be, at worst, a temporary fix. The CVE Foundation's formation is a promising step toward diversification, potentially mirroring models like the Linux Foundation, where industry stakeholders are going to pool the resources to sustain critical infrastructure. Now, private funding could stabilize the program, but it raises questions about governance. Will commercial interests influence the CVE prioritization? Will small organizations have a voice? And the challenge there is to balance transparency and inclusivity to maintain trust. If you think about it, if you're writing a check to sit at the table, you might be expecting to have a little bit more weight on the measure when something comes out. And what happens if it's a very high-rated vulnerability that's going to embarrass you as a company? Are you going to want this thing to go out public right away? Do you want to do a little bit of damage control first? So these are all the potential conflicts of interest that could be there. I'm not saying they are going to happen, but those are the things that people worry about. Another alternative, another possibility could be alternative systems, like the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA, has recently launched the European Vulnerability Database, or EUVD. And this is going to aggregate vulnerability data from multiple sources. The Computer Incident Response Center Luxembourg is also developing a decentralized global CVE, or the GCVE system. And these could complement or compete with CVE, but fragmentation risks recreating the chaos from 1999 and before of inconsistent naming. But for now, CVE's 25-year legacy and global adoption make it the de facto standard, but its future dominance is not guaranteed. Now, what's the best case scenario? CVE Foundation secures sustainable funding. The program evolves to handle the growing volume of vulnerabilities. Last summer, for instance, insufficient resources led to a backlog of unprocessed CVEs. Now, a worst-case scenario would see funding lapse again, forcing organizations to rely on fragmented or proprietary databases, slowing response time, increasing exposure to exploits. Now, you as a security leader, you need to prepare for both potential outcomes by strengthening your internal triage process and monitoring alternative sources like the EUVD or commercial threat feeds. So to wrap up today, let's think about it. The CVE funding crisis was a bit of a wake-up call. The program's role as a global catalog for vulnerabilities really non-negotiable. It's the foundation of coordinated defense against cyber threats. And the recent scare underscores the fragility of relying on a single funding source, be it the U.S. federal government, but the community's response from CISA's extension to the CVE's Foundation launch shows resilience. As security leaders, stay vigilant. Leverage CVE and CVSS to prioritize your risks, but build robust processes that don't hinge solely on a single system. The future of cybersecurity is going to depend upon adaptability and collaboration. So thank you very much for tuning in to CISO Tradecraft. I hope you found this of interest. If you've got something to give us back in terms of a comment, please do so. We welcome the dialogue back and forth. We're on LinkedIn, CISO Tradecraft. And also, if you're following us on YouTube, wonderful. Give us a like if you wouldn't mind. If you're following us on the podcast channel, check us out on YouTube. We've got over 40,000 followers there, and we think that, although you're just looking at me, but I want to know, is it worth going ahead and helping turn this show from just kind of a spoken show where a lot of people listen to it as a podcast or something visual where I can go and have charts and diagrams and pictures and things like that, which I'm not doing yet because I've got the sense that most of you are listening to the podcast, but I want to hear back from you. Let me know. So until next time, stay on top of your security game. This is your host, G. Mark Hardy. Thank you for listening or watching, and stay safe out there.